Hello and welcome to Lecture 2, an overview of epidemiology. My name is Teresa Stack. I'm an assistant professor at Montana Tech at the University of Montana, and I'll be providing this information to you today. So it'll cover a brief description of epidemiology. We'll discuss the purpose of epidemiology research, and this will of course be based off of the 5 characteristics within our within our epidemiology text by Gordis. I'll also go through some historical context so that you can understand where epidemiology came from, both public health and occupational. And then we'll talk a little bit about where epidemiology is going. So what is epidemiology? Epidemiology is the science that studies the patterns, causes, and effects of health and disease conditions in defined populations. It is the cornerstone of public health and informs policy decisions and evidence-based practice by identifying risk factors for disease and targets for preventative care. Epidemiologists help with the design, collection, and statistical analysis of data and interpretation and dissemination of the results. Epidemiologists have developed specific methodologies for studying different types of populations. And some of the terms that you see here on the slide will help you understand what we'll be talking about throughout the entire semester. So rates, ratios, proportions, epidemic versus endemic, incidence rates, prevalence rates, clinical-based trials, and we talk a lot about the denominator. So there is a heavy background in statistics when you look at epidemiology, but don't be put off by the math. It's pretty basic descriptive statistics, and most people can really grasp onto it relatively easily. So what's the actual term epidemiology mean? Well, epi means upon or among. Demos, of course, means people, and logistica means the study of. And epidemiology literally means the study of what is upon the people. And this term people is really important in understanding what epidemiology is. Epidemiology is concerned with the distribution of disease as categorized by time, place, and person, as well as it also focuses on hypothesis testing. Epidemiology studies the distribution, so where is disease or events occurring within a set population, and the determinants of that, what's causing the disease or the event, or what is causing the protective factor. And they look at health events and states, so diseases, disorders, morbidity, mortality, as well as events. So for example, traffic accidents or falls. And they look at defined human populations, and they apply the study to hopefully, one of the reasons is to control the risk factors or the determinants, and to also put policy in place and establish guidelines so we truly understand the etiology of what's happening in our populations. It assumes that disease is not randomly distributed through a population. This is really important. If it was randomly distributed, then we couldn't use our statistics to understand how diseases and events are occurring, on who are they occurring, at what time and place are they occurring, what are the trends over time and within populations. And so what epidemiology is not, and I think this is important to understand the difference. Epidemiology is what is upon humans. So it's not toxicological studies. So you don't, if it's dealing with animals, we're not looking at epidemiology. So for example, the effects of an Ebola vaccine on monkeys, whether this vaccine prevents the disease in monkeys, that would not be epidemiology. Now, you could take this one step further and say, does the vaccine in monkeys somehow have an effect on what happens when people come in contact with monkeys? That would be different. Epidemiology is also based on a proportion of the population. The bigger your N, the bigger your denominator, the bigger your data set, the better your statistics and epidemiology. That's both occupational and public health. So it can't be based off a single event or a single case study. And it also doesn't look at non-human types of outcomes. So for example, developing a new analysis for detecting breast cancer, that wouldn't be an epidemiological study because although breast cancer affects humans, the study itself is not on a human population. So that distinction is pretty important. Epidemiology is based into two broad categories. There's descriptive epidemiology, which we will spend most of our time in this particular course speaking about, versus analytical epidemiology. So descriptive epidemiology is concerned with the distribution of diseases as categorized by time, place, and person. So for example, 8 Montana occupational fatalities in 2013. 8 would be, or Montana, of course, would be our place, and 2013 would be our time, and part of the person is the occupation, and that there were 8 of them, and that would also be how many. But that shows you an example of descriptive epidemiology. Descriptive epidemiology can identify patterns among cases and in populations by time, place, and person. From these observations, we're able to develop hypotheses about the causes of these patterns and about other factors, risk factors, that increase the risk of disease and event or are protective. And so when we develop our hypotheses, we do this through descriptive epidemiology, and that later turns into analytical epidemiology. Analytical epidemiology focuses on the determinants of the risk factors of that disease by testing hypothesis. And usually analytical epidemiology has to do with case controls and intervention studies, where descriptive epidemiology would be seen in this example here. Head injury fatalities caused by, so what is happening would be a head injury. In what time? Well, this graph should be labeled. Let's say it was 2013. In what place? Oh, this graph should be labeled all of the United States. Oh, I guess my slides were backwards. So you got the idea of being descriptive and analytical epidemiology. And so just to go through quickly what analytical epidemiology is, analytical epidemiology is when you have a case control study. And so this kind of describes, again, person, place, and time. So you have some kind of people. This is your source. And within your source, you have some people that have diseases versus people who don't. And so the people that have your diseases usually become your cases, and we try to match them to people that don't have the disease that are your controls. You can also look at this with, and then from matching your cases and controls, now sometimes you don't only match your cases and controls, but you then submatch your risk factors. And that's what analytical epidemiology does, is it looks at risk factor exposures in both your cases and in your controls, and tries to determine whether those risk factors are causing the disease, more probable than not, or are protective in some way. And that's the difference between descriptive epidemiology and analytical epidemiology. And of course, we'll talk more about all of these as we go through the semester together. And so there are some various subcategories of epidemiology. There's occupational and injury, which we'll talk about a lot in this course. There's also environmental epidemiology, nutritional, psychopharmaceutical, cancer-specific epidemiology, and genetic or molecular epidemiology. And we'll cover a lot of these when we're talking about different studies and trying to make, give you good examples. And so the general principles pretty much apply completely through whether you're talking descriptive epidemiology or analytical epidemiology. And so what is occupational epidemiology? Well, it's the study of health effects, whether it's injury, disease, or an event, of, and those health effects of certain factors, risk factors, to which people are exposed to in the work environment. So we specifically focus on the work environment in occupational epidemiology. And these factors, we usually think, or at least I usually think, chemical exposures as industrial hygienists. But then as an ergonomist, you would think physical exposures, heat, noise, radiation, energy, force, posture, repetition. If you're in a hospital in the medical field, you may be thinking more biological factors or microbiological factors. And then also we look at what's preventative, which risk factors are preventative, and what next would be risk factors, right? Maybe benefit factors. So for example, exercise reduces my risk of developing cardiovascular disease. And I think that when you take a look at epidemiology and we start to go through and looking at some different papers and also the way data is described, you'll see that occupational epidemiology is nice in that you have a group of people. If they're in a similar exposure group, then you have a nice cohort of people. And it allows for a pretty rigorous assessment of exposures if you're able to really understand the population that you're dealing with. And this highlights the importance of really good record keeping, because some of the outcomes, or the OSHA PELs or OELs, or putting different policies in place based on what's happening in the worker population, comes from our record keeping. So I think that this highlights it in some way. So I wanted to give a little historic perspective on chemical exposure and epidemiology. And some of you guys may know this, and maybe some of you all don't. So, kind of bear with me if you've heard this before, but we know that disease resulting from exposures to chemicals, dust, physical agents existed since people handled them. But the link was really not understood as to what was happening internally through maybe bioaccumulation or biotransfer, what the different combination of exposures were causing different kinds of diseases. But one of the first, or at least documented links between exposure and disease and prevention was Pliny the Elder in 23 through 79 AD. And he described in his writings using animal bladders to protect workers in mines from zinc and sulfur exposures. And then, of course, there was Georgius Arcola, who was by far the father of mineralogy, or known as the original Metallica, right? Because he published a 12-volume set in 1556, which was called De Re Metallica. And this is really kind of famous in the occupational safety and health realm because of the woodcuts that he used to describe different types of processes in which silver was removed from mines and smelted, and control practices that can be put in place to keep down exposures to dust and people, touching the silver, which he later learned was part of how people were sick. And so he described in his Metallica set diseases of the lungs, joints, and eyes. And he found that miners would have black ulcers on their wounds that would eat all the way through the bone, and it would corrode. As it would corrode through, it would look like it was corroding through iron. And there was certain types of cadmium which eats away at the feet of workers when they become wet. And similarity, they found that their eyes and their hands and their lungs were affected by exposure. And later we recognized the manifestations of arsenic and cadmium when it occurs together, how it is corrosive and it eats away at the workers, especially when it's mixed with water. And he saw that the dust had corrosive qualities that ate away at the lungs, and this was later determined to be silicosis, tuberculosis, and lung cancer. And probably one of the first documented exposures again, or kind of coming forward a little bit more into the 4th century, where lead poisoning was identified amongst minors, and we know that lead interferes with a variety of body processes, and it's definitely toxic to the neurological system, and over time it kind of clogs up your blood exchange areas. And I think that what's kind of interesting about this particular slide is that just recently, in 2014, federal agents raided USA Grass right here in Bozeman, Montana, so that's about an hour from Butte, and they found high levels of lead exposure in workers where the dust, although they were wearing personal protective equipment when they were repacking firearms, their sanitation methods were so poor that the dust was getting brought into the eating facility, and where people were changing, it was on their hands. They didn't necessarily know the risk factors associated with it, and they didn't have good HAZCOM, and people had elevated lead levels in that particular area. So probably my most famous, I shouldn't say it that way, but the founder of occupational medicine, I believe, in my opinion, or at least somebody who I've looked at repeatedly because of my background in ergonomics, is Bernardo Ramazzini. And he was an occupational physician, and he was one of the first people who really linked not only what people were being exposed to, what diseases were coming, or injuries that were likely to occur, but also controls that can be put into place. And so in 1700, he wrote, "The first and most potent is the harmful character of the material that they handle, for these emit noxious vapors and very fine particles, and induce particular diseases in humans." And here we would call this the study of airborne contaminants, aerosols, gases, vapors, and kind of the start of industrial hygiene. The second cause I ascribe to certain violent and irregular motions and unnatural postures of the body, by reason of which the natural structure of the vital machine is so impaired that serious disease gradually develops. The study of ergonomics, I believe that this is, and looking at cumulative trauma diseases that develop slowly over time. So this is really where data sets are starting to come together, and it's through just descriptive statistics. And Bernardo Ramazzini recommended that physicians extend their list of questions first put together to include what is your occupation, so people can understand what people's occupations truly are. And we're all familiar with this one, but some folks may not have realized that, asbestos was used not only as an insulating material, but it was used in every part of people's lives from 1920 all the way through. Well, still today people are exposed to asbestos. But in 1939, here's a picture of asbestos. That says asbestosis. It should just say asbestos. Snowflake choose analogy displays. And it was in 1964 that Dr. Irving Skilkoff reported on the effects of asbestos at a conference. And this shows you how epidemiology is just not one case or a few cases, but that it's the accumulation of cases over time. So from 1943, where the doctor was able to see the growth of malignant cells in the pleural lining of the lungs, and other physicians who were doing autopsies were finding the same through respiratory diseases and diagnosing respiratory cancer that looks very similar. And so this type of cancer, as you know, mesothelioma, is relatively rare and pretty much only caused by exposure to asbestos. Now, you can have cancer growth in your pleural in other organs based on different types of exposure, but this one's pretty insipidous to asbestos itself. So it took from 1943 with data gathering together and the number of cases stacking up against each other, and then understanding, of course, not only the epidemiology, the descriptive statistics, but also the toxicological effects of how your body works to digest or not digest. In the case of asbestos, the material, it just bioaccumulates. And that in 1962, that's when they brought together asbestos workers having a higher likelihood of developing this type of disease. And we know that, well, people are still exposed today to all different types of asbestos. But that's just kind of your historical perspective and the occupational link to epidemiology. And so now the second part of this introduction to epidemiology is like, why do we do it? And this is based off of the 5 principles from our textbook. And so first we really need to understand, remember that epidemiology studies effects on humans, and that laboratory studies or animal research where you can have greater controls on exposure, it doesn't mean that it completely cross-correlates to environmental exposures and human anatomy and physiology in itself. So it's really important that you try to compare as much as possible all the different types of scientific research together when you're trying to draw an informed decision. And so the first reason is to look at the etiology of a specific disease or groups of diseases by combining epidemiological data. So we're looking at how does a disease progress in time. And that slide wasn't supposed to be there, or this slide. Sorry about that. I was going to read it to you instead of having it there. Oops. Oh dear. Okay, going back. Sorry. Rewind. Is to look at the etiology of a specific disease, and that's where we're combining events together. So we combine epidemiological data with other data. And so an example of that was the recognition of a very rare type of liver disorder that was found amongst plastic manufacturers. So again, we have a group of studies where we have people with a similar outcome, this very rare liver angiocarcinoma found on the liver of plastic miners. And later they were able to link the epidemiology data, the descriptive statistics with the toxicological data and the toxic properties of vinyl chloride. And so we were able to tease out through our epidemiological studies how this disease progressed over time. So that was reason number 1. And reason number 2 why we do epidemiological study is to determine the extent of the disease found in a population or in a community. So how widespread is alcoholism in rural Alaska versus sunny San Diego? How widespread is lung cancer among TIG welders versus underwater welders? So we're looking at the extent of the disease and what the impact is of it. And in understanding the extent of it, sometimes we're able to better understand where to spend your resources to put controls in place. And so remember again that epidemiology, we're determined with person, place, and time, but we're also concerned with risk factors and modes of transmission. And one way to use this is the way students in journalism are taught that in a good news story, whether it be about a bank robbery, a dramatic rescue, or a presidential candidate, you must always include the 5 W's. And so if you include these, it makes for a good story. And in understanding epidemiology, whether it's use of mammograms to detect early breast cancer or the outbreak of norovirus on a cruise ship, we try to use our 5 W's. What, who, where, when, and why. And so when we look at this in the epidemiological context, what is the health event? Who is the description of the person that is affected by it? Places, where, and time is, of course, when. And then your causes, or your why, would be your risk factors or your modes of transmission. So the third reason that we do epidemiological inquiry is to study the natural progression of a disease or the prognosis of a disease. How does it progress over time, and by putting certain types of controls in place, can we stop or slow the progression? And a really great example of this, the natural progression of disease, is looking at how Ebola typically manifested itself, and signs and symptoms came out when people became contagious, and if controls weren't put into place, how quickly a person would die. In the occupational setting, it is useful when it's applied to monitoring patients for survival for different diseases. So, for example, workers with occupational-related conditions, they may be removed from the environment, and so we stop their risk factor. And is it possible? It certainly is possible to track how removal changed an outcome. So, for example, a worker who had carpal tunnel syndrome that wasn't fully developed, it wasn't the stage 4 carpal tunnel syndrome where they couldn't grasp onto an object without having severe pain, or maybe they would have no strength at all in their hands. And then, so that would be stage 4. Let's say we caught it at stage 2, where you have pins and needles sensation and tingling in your hands, pain that wakes you up in the middle of the night. And then we change your risk factors, right? So we change the progression of your disease over time. Will you not progress to stage 4? Will you stay at stage 2? Or over time, with putting therapies in place and changing your risk factors, will you actually go back down to stage 1 or have no disorder anymore, carpal tunnel syndrome? So this is an example of where epidemiology studies can take a look at how things change over time with intervention studies in place. The monitoring of workers' respiratory health can also help to describe which exposure situations lead to a worsening or exacerbation of individuals with occupational asthma, and which controls are being effective or not. And this is part of how OSHA is using epidemiological studies to do workplace monitoring, and they were able to recognize that diisocyanate is a leading cause of occupational asthma. And this is an example of where diisocyanates are being applied, they're being sprayed on, usually again an insulating type material. And if you go to, what slide am I on? And if you go to slide 27, you'd be able to select the links and go to the OSHA website if you wanted more information on diisocyanates. But we're also taking a look at, looking at occupational exposures and looking at the trend over time and how we're trying to put controls in place. Several studies have identified silica as a potential occupational carcinogen, and it's again through combining our epidemiological studies as well as with the toxicological data that we can hopefully put rules in place in which it needs to be more tightly regulated without putting undue constraints or controls on a particular employer who needs to make money as well. And there's a big push now to regulate this, probably in part because of the dust that's coming out of fracking operations. And you can see this here. So our fourth reason for conducting epidemiological, I try to say that 3 times fast, epidemiological inquiry, is to look at whether existing or new preventive measures can be put into place. And again, this is typically used in the case control studies and more analytical epidemiology, but we do look at it in the occupational setting as well. I mean, look at how we've decreased electrocution. Used to be the third way in which people were suffered a fatality in the workplace, and now that has been replaced in part because of the education and training that we put into place. And so that would be a new preventative measure as far as occupational exposures go versus therapeutic measures, such as trying to put certain kinds of treatment drugs in place to keep the symptoms of AIDS down. And finally, we're evaluating our control measures as far as industrial hygiene goes. And this helps us to establish action levels, to change occupational exposure levels, and to put public health policies in place. And so in everything that we do in epidemiology, we're trying as much as possible to understand something about the population and then therein and put controls in place for it. So where did Epi come from? I got a little bit of history here to talk about, and then I think it will help you understand really how epidemiology started in the public health centers of our communities. So epidemiology certainly started around in the 1600s, and when we were looking at the exposure of infectious diseases on the population. But I have this one in here, although I kind of skipped around here because that slide was a little bit out of place. So I'm going back to 4000 BC, where they were trying to explain that there was different types of reasons for people developing disease and it occurring in certain populations that weren't supernatural. So there was this thought between everything in the environment was supernatural versus they were actual causes in which people were doing. Okay, sorry for the back jump there. I was distracted by a ringing phone. So I want to go through some history of epidemiology, and it really took its roots in the 1600s when we were able to put data together with logical determinants of why certain events were happening, why diseases were happening among people, and we were able to take a closer look at putting control measures in place. And so one of the first published epidemiological studies was in 1662, where John Gaunt, who was a member of the Royal Society of London, published the first comparative study. And this was because we started to keep better records on the number of births, the number of deaths, and why people were dying. And he compiled it together, and he observed high infant mortality rates, which you certainly would have had early on in the 1600s before we really understood things like sanitation, for example. And there were seasonal variations in deaths. People tend to die more frequently in southern climates in summer months versus people in northern climates die more frequently in colder months. He saw the difference between acute diseases, which come on fast and are able to be curable in some people, versus chronic diseases, which last long periods of time. And differences in urban and rural, and we certainly see this today, but back in 1662, this was a breakthrough. And this is also how we describe the distribution of diseases today. But what he saw most frequently were yellow fever, smallpox, typhus, typhoid, dysentery, scarlet fever, and influenza. And think about these, just think about these for a little bit. We rarely see, we eradicated smallpox. We rarely see scarlet fever anymore. We're able to control, at least in some people, or most people, influenza, depending on if we get the strain right. We control typhoid in some populations through good sanitation as well as dysentery. And so in understanding what was the main cause of why people were passing away and putting their risk factors together, just basically through descriptive statistics, they were able to make some significant changes. And this is why we think public health. And I think this is really an interesting one because you might not have known where the term scurvy dog came from, but in 1747, James Lind investigated the high rate of scurvy among British sailors, and he conducted a couple of controlled experiments where some patients were offered dietary supplements such as limes and lemons. Other subjects just received water. One group received seawater, and he saw that very quickly the people that were that got the limes and the lemons or the citrus recovered quickly. And that's how scurvy is actually found out that it's caused by deficiency in vitamin C, and it's pretty rare today. But that limes and lemons and citrus was required on ships that went long distances now to prevent that. And that's where the term scurvy dog came from. And so the next few slides will be probably one of the most famous investigations done and where epidemiology and public health really got its roots. And this was John Snow's investigation to the huge cholera outbreak in London, which was wiping out large portions of the population. And if you're interested in it, really there's a cool article from a book called Visual Explanations posted on Moodle that has some additional reading in it. That really describes what the way Snow was able to lay this out. But here is what Snow did, is he had a hunch that the cholera was being caused by water, and but he couldn't really make a case for it. And the cholera cases just kept mounting one on top of the other on top of the other, so the prevalence rate and the incident rate was going up and up and up really quickly, and people were passing away from it. And he drew a map in which illustrated all these little red lines actually illustrates the number of deaths in a household. So you can see that really, let's see, I need to get a marker here. Oops. In this area here, you had a relatively high number of deaths versus a low number of deaths in this area and over here and over here. And you could kind of see this clustering effect. And because of that, he felt very certain that it was because of the water which linked the people together. So who was dying of cholera, where were they? And of course deaths were increasing over time. And so he then, the way the story goes is he removed the handle on the Broad Street pump, and the incidence or the outbreaks of cholera decreased significantly. There are some different points of view on whether it would have started to go down anyways because people were just moving out of the area. But it certainly had a dramatic decrease when you look at the number of cases versus the time in which he removed the Broad Street well handle. And so what else Snow found out about looking at this as far as place goes is that the water was also running this way because of the slope of the land, and it was running downhill. And we, again, had rather poor sanitation in that time period in which people would pour their pee buckets out on the street, and it was all running into this particular area. And there's an interesting side note about this particular study that I think is maybe notable to some people, is that you can see in this area right here, near the brewery, you had a rather low incident rate of cholera deaths versus up in this area over here. And it's believed that the people that lived near the brewery worked in the brewery and they drank more beer than water, and so it had a protective effect for them. But not surprisingly, people weren't convinced, even though he removed the Broad Street well handbook, so he combined it with some other epidemiological data. And you can see, look at the number of deaths per household in this area versus the number of deaths per household in this area. And throughout London. So John Snow was able to find out the cause of the cholera outbreak, stop the outbreak, and he was able to discover this without using toxicological or microbiological information. And it wasn't until, I think it was the 1800s, in which they really identified the microbe which causes cholera. And so just a little bit about public health. That certainly brings us into public health, right? We want to keep our wells free so we don't get a whole bunch of outbreaks. Hopefully we can keep all sorts of contaminants from running in our drinking water. I always think about, looking at, there was a huge chemical spill from Freedom Industries 2 years ago in West Virginia. And are we, in a number of years, going to collect epidemiological data about a certain number of outbreaks of a type of disease that's higher in that area versus another area, and we can link it back to the spill? Or maybe not. But this is an implication of public health, and you have these disasters, or maybe not disasters, just events that are occurring in our population. And so public health is concerned with monitoring the health statuses of communities to identify health risks, to look at vital statistics and discrepancies or disparities amongst groups of people, and trying to even that out somehow, to diagnose and investigate health problems and hazards in community, and to really look at the capacity of our hospitals and our laboratories to be able to handle the health outcomes that are out there. Public health also informs, educates, and empowers people about health decisions and shapes attitudes in communities and decision makers. It can mobilize communities to identify and solve health problems and certainly develop policies and put them in place. Public health is also concerned with enforcement of laws and regulations to protect public health and safety. I mean, we have certain reportable diseases that when a doctor diagnosed, for example, somebody with syphilis, we would get a call at the public health department, well, maybe not syphilis, let's say chlamydia or gonorrhea. That happened a number of times. And as public health officials, we had to call that person and get all of their sexual contacts, and then call all of those people and try to get all of their sexual contacts and inform them that they had just been exposed to a communicable disease. And there's an example of what your public health department is doing for you. And it was really hard to do that in a small community when I was the public health director for Madison County. But at the time, we hope that we educate people about the risk factors that are out there. And public health tries to link people that have needs to the resources that are available to them, and make people accountable for population-based services so that we understand how we can better serve our community. So what has public health done for us in the past 100 years? The current life expectancy in 2013 is 78.7 years versus the life expectancy in 1900, which was 47 years. So we can thank public health for another 25 years of life. They've done this through vaccines. There are now 50,000 fewer cases of smallpox that occurred in 1900. 19,000 fewer cases of measles that occurred in 1941, 21,000 fewer cases of polio than that occurred in 1951. Programs of population-wide vaccines resulted in the eradication of smallpox, eliminated polio in the world, and controlled measles, mumps, rubella, typhus, measles, mumps, tetanus, diphtheria, in the United States and other parts of the world. And you might be wondering why there was a recent measles outbreak in California and where the infected case, or index case as it's called in public health, came from. And you think about not vaccinating as one should and how that causes ripple effects through a community. Motor vehicle safety. Since 1925, the annual death rate for motor vehicle travel has decreased 90%. Seat belts have saved approximately 85,000 lives. Child safety seats have reduced risk of infant death by 69%. And community awareness, such as driving while intoxicated regulations, have reduced alcohol-related deaths by 32%. We've controlled infectious diseases such as typhoid and cholera, which were major causes of illness and death in the early 20th century. And we've dramatically decreased deaths from having poor sanitation. We've also discovered the use of antimicrobial therapy that is public in the control of things like tuberculosis and sexually transmitted diseases. We have a decline in death rates from coronary heart disease and stroke, deaths from both of which, due to such risk factors as smoking and high blood pressure, were not known well in 1940. But since 1972, death rates from coronary heart disease have decreased by 51%. We've recognized the use of tobacco, and in 1964 since 1964 has resulted in a significant decrease in exposure to primary and secondhand smoke. Before then, really the health effects weren't really widely understood, or what can be done to put control measures in place. And to end on a happy note, healthy mothers and babies has resulted in better hygiene and nutrition, antibiotics, access to health care, technology, maternal and neonatal medicine, and immunizations. Since 1900, infant mortality has decreased more than 90%, and maternal mortality has decreased by 99%. Thank you, Public Health, for helping us, and Epidemiology, in understanding what is upon the people and finding ways to make that better. I hope you have a wonderful day.